Hallo zusammen und willkommen. Ich bin Lyle Young, a member of the Christian Science Board of Lectureship, speaking to you from Ottawa, Canada. And welcome if you're right there in Hamburg, in another part of Germany, or in another part of the world. Much thanks to Third Church of Christ Scientist in Hamburg, Altona, for sponsoring this talk. Life is beautiful. If you think of a lifelong happy friendship, or a marvelous family day with several generations around a common table, or magnificent natural scenery, or a painting that captures that brief moment when the moonlight is shimmering on the surface of a lake, or a painting that in just a few words gives a profound or a poem that in just a few words gives a profound insight. But life is never just beautiful. I think it's safe to say that we all know life and its challenges, its disappointments, its frustrations, its conflicts, big and small, its fears and its illnesses, including the contagious ones. Christian Science presents a new and higher concept of who God is, a new and fresh concept of who we are as the children of God. This new and fresh concept can lift us above the limitations, can lift us above the discords of human life, and show us who we truly are eternally as expressions of the divine, and how we truly are eternally, always happy, always at peace, and always well. Mary Baker Eddy, the discoverer of Christian Science, knew human life very well. She grew up in the 1820s and 1830s in the part of the United States called New England, specifically New Hampshire. And I want to explain to you about Christian Science by first giving you a bit of background information about the person who discovered it. So she grew up in New England in the 1820s and 1830s, New England where the city of Boston is, for example. She was the sixth child in a family of 6 children on a family farm. As a little girl, she loved God deeply, and she delighted in her family. Because she was often sick, she couldn't attend school regularly, but she was intensely interested in learning. She was intensely interested in the world around her. She was strongly encouraged in her studies by her scholarly brother, Albert. She was strongly encouraged, especially by her mother, to put into practice the teachings of Jesus. At age 22, Mary Baker married George Glover, a builder, and together they moved to a very different part of the United States, to North Carolina. There, after 6 months, and in spite of their best prayers, he died suddenly of yellow fever, leaving her alone and expecting. She returned to New Hampshire, where she lived initially with her parents and later with a sister. When her little son was born, she named him George after the father. He was a handful. He was a wild, energetic little boy. And because she was often sick, it was challenging for her to care for him. A little later, the rest of her family, concerned about her health and against her wishes, had the child taken away and placed in the care of another family. Of course, that broke her heart. And I think that it was one of the reasons why she wanted to marry again, to form a family circle to receive back her little son. She married Daniel Patterson, an itinerant dentist. But theirs was not a happy marriage. His income was never regular enough that they could enjoy much financial stability. And towards the end of the marriage, he was no longer faithful. Although she worked at saving that marriage during more than 20 years, finally, she divorced him. And the family with whom her little son was living moved to what at that time was considered to be the far west, to the state of Minnesota, and he was told that his mother had passed on. She heard nothing from him for more than 5 years and didn't see him again for close to 25 years. Of course, we all have challenges. How was Mary Baker facing hers? By striving even more to put into practice the teachings of Jesus, by turning even more fully to the Bible. She knew that the Bible is filled with the promise that God is always present to help us in moments of difficulty. But how to prove that practically in the midst of loneliness, poverty, and ill health? During this time, she explored various ways of improving her health: conventional medicine, homeopathy, a system of healing that was very popular at that time called the water cure, and even what we today would call hypnotism. For a time, she used the services of a well-known mental healer, Phineas Quimby, and she seemed much better. But only for a time. And finally, she was disappointed because the basis of his system of healing wasn't the spiritual and moral principle that was the basis of the healing works of Jesus. In 1866, she had a breakthrough. She was walking to a temperance meeting. That was a kind of meeting that was quite common in that day, organized to try to discourage the consumption of alcohol. It was winter, February, in Lynn, Massachusetts, not far from Boston. And walking to this temperance meeting, she fell on a slippery sidewalk, and because of the fall, became unconscious. She was taken to a house that wasn't far from there. In addition to what seemed to be a concussion, the physician who attended her also diagnosed serious internal injuries and didn't think that she would survive. But she came to and asked for a Bible. Then, in a moment of great inspiration, while she was reading one of the accounts of Jesus' healings, her decades of searching for spiritual answers, her decades of searching for better health, culminated in a healing. She was suddenly well, to the surprise of her friends. And although she experienced minor relapses over the next few months, she was finally entirely healed, not only of the effects of the fall, but ever after that experience, she enjoyed better health than before. What had she seen? Later, she would write that during those moments of great inspiration, she saw that entirely beyond anything biological or organic, entirely beyond anything physical, was the reality of God as infinite life. And she was at one with this life. And in this relationship of oneness, she had everything that she would ever need, including her health. Throughout centuries, throughout history, many people have been healed and then they've simply gone on with their lives. But she wanted to understand how she had been healed. Why was she healed when she was healed? Why not earlier or later? And could the good results be repeated in other cases? Could the good results be experienced by other people? Very naturally for her, she turned even more fully to the Bible. And she was taking detailed notes on what she was studying. She was finding that with this understanding of God as being infinite life, with this understanding of identity as being the spiritual expression of this life, she could consistently heal other people. And not much later, she began to heal others with this. She began to teach others how to heal with this understanding. So the fact that not just she, but others as well could heal with this understanding confirmed for her that the capacity to heal wasn't her personal capacity, but that she had come to understand the science of healing that was the basis of the healing works of Jesus. These healings were important physical healings: malaria, diphtheria, tuberculosis. But there was also a moral dimension to this healing work. Often the person who was healed felt himself or herself to be uplifted spiritually. Often the person became a better person, less selfish, for example. In 1875, she published for the first time what would truly be her principal work. This work here. And in English, here's what it looks. Here's the picture of the book in German. In English, the title is Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. So she had organized all of her notes and put them in this book. In this book, she explains how to be healed of a contagious disease, even if one's been directly exposed to that contagious disease. She tells as well how to be protected from disease, from a contagious disease, through prayer alone. So through prayer, you could both be protected from getting a contagious disease, and if it were necessary, you could be healed of that contagious disease through prayer. But before talking more specifically about that, I wanted to read two passages that are perhaps even more fundamental. First, this passage. It says here, the Christ-like understanding of scientific being and divine healing includes a perfect principle and idea, perfect God and perfect man, as the basis of thought and demonstration. Perfect God and perfect man, the basis of thought and demonstration. She wasn't saying that humans are perfect. No, she was saying that beyond everything human is the perfection of God. And each of us, in our true spiritual being, manifests that divine perfection. A second passage. Here it says, you can prove for yourself, dear reader, the science of healing, and so ascertain if the author has given you the correct interpretation of Scripture. Someone who did just that was Asa Gilbert Eddy. And in 1877, they married, and so Mary Baker became Mary Baker Eddy. Speaking of demonstrating this science for oneself, I wanted to recount two personal experiences. One in the context of COVID-19 a bit later, but first, an experience that I had about 15 years ago. I began to experience very sharp pains in my lower abdomen. These, in truth, were painful episodes that lasted 2 or 3 hours. Of course, I prayed with some of these very ideas, that God is infinite, perfect life, and that I'm perfect as the spiritual expression of this life, free from fear, free from pain. During that time, I was working for the Church of Christ Scientist in Boston, and for my job, I needed to appear in public to speak 6 times a week. But happily, these painful episodes never interfered with my doing that work. They came on other days, at other times. I was so grateful for that. Also, during a part of that time, I was hosting family members from another city. And had they realized that I was experiencing those very sharp pains, they would have been very concerned. But happily, they never learned that I was experiencing those pains. If I was with them and had those pains and needed to pray, I could simply explain that I had work to do, and I could go to another part of the house to pray. That I had work to do wasn't surprising. I almost always had lots of work to do. I was very grateful that they were never concerned. In fact, these painful episodes made me think of the experience of a family member decades before, when the family member was hospitalized and treated for gallstones. Also, during a part of this time, I received help from first one Christian Science practitioner and later from another. And I should say that a Christian Science practitioner is someone who gives his or her full time to helping others in prayer. Together we prayed, we talked about passages from the Bible and from Science and Health. I was so grateful for their help. The painful episodes stopped after about 2 or 3 weeks. They stopped until they came back again about 5 months later. But this time I was very much ready to confront and to meet these fears, to meet these pains with much authority and with the great conviction of my present perfection and freedom as the Son of God. So I met those pains, I met those fears, and those pains stopped entirely. And as I say, that was about 15 years ago. Such a healing has as its basis a higher concept of identity. The basis of my prayers was that I'm spiritual as God's perfect image and likeness, to use Bible language. Such a healing has as its premise a higher concept of who God is. Who is God? Christian Science teaches that he or she, instead of being one thing amongst many things in the universe, instead of being one entity amongst many entities in the universe, that in truth, God is infinite. God is all. But how can that be? How can God be infinite and all if we live in a world made up of things? Mary Baker Eddy found in the scriptures a sense of God as being infinite love, infinite unopposed love, the only life, the only intelligence, the only mind, the only substance of the universe, and that this was the basis of the healings and of the teachings of Jesus. Of course, we can read in 1 John in the Bible that God is love. Also, we can read in the Gospel of Luke what has sometimes been called the pearl of parables, the parable of the prodigal son. In this parable, recounted by Jesus, a father whose heart is filled with compassion, a father whose heart is filled with love, welcomes back his youngest son who has treated him most disrespectfully and who has simply gone off and wasted his inheritance. When the son realizes he has nothing left, not even anything to eat, he decides to go back to the father, but he doesn't think that the father will take him back as a son, perhaps as a servant, and at least in that way he'll have something to eat. But when he's going back, the father sees him from a long ways off, and the father runs to meet him, kisses him, throws his arms around him, and hugs him. And the father says that he wants to celebrate because he says, "This, my son, was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." With this parable, Jesus was teaching the nature of God as infinite, you could even say unconditional love for each and every one of us. What Mary Baker Eddy was seeing was truly revolutionary and was challenging some of the most basic assumptions of human thought itself. She wasn't seeing that there are discords and difficulties and diseases, including contagious diseases, and then there's also infinite love. She was seeing that infinite love is so infinite that it actually exists instead of an imperfect material creation. In other words, there isn't a basic human context in which suffering is normal, natural, and inevitable for every one of us, and then there's also infinite love. She was seeing that infinite love is so infinite that it actually excludes the existence of anything other than this love and its expression. I think it's easy to see that with a starting point being infinite, unopposed love, the only substance of the universe, we may need to rethink who we are. The conventional way of thinking is that we're physical beings who are evolving physically in a physical universe that itself is evolving physically. But the first thing that we can say right off is that each of us, in truth, simply shines eternally as the expression of this love. And that identity is not subject to being lessened in any way. Identity can't be attacked in any way. Identity can't in any way be anything less than perfect. Identity itself is not subject to contamination. Here's an analogy to help you see exactly what I mean. Think of a building with 3 stories. So you have the ground floor, the second story, and the third story. Each story is going to symbolize a concept of who we are, a concept of identity. The ground story, the ground floor, could symbolize a sense of identity as being exclusively physical. So the person is born physically, shaped by the genes of his or her parents, by the person's first experiences in life, and later by other experiences. So the person is made up of atoms and chemicals. The person lives a certain number of years, and hopefully the person loves at least a little bit, and then the person is no more. That's one concept of identity. The second story could symbolize a sense of identity as being essentially physical. So the person is living physically. But in addition, the person has a soul inside the body. So the body lives a certain number of years, and then the body is no more. But the soul survives, although unfortunately, nobody knows exactly in what form. But I'd like to talk to you about a third sense of identity, the third story. According to this sense of identity, each of us is purely spiritual. And what makes us who we are is not how tall we are or how old we are or even the color of our skin, but each of us is a unique spiritual expression of the infinite gamut of qualities of this love. Qualities like joy, wisdom, cheerfulness, goodness, and so on. It's from this third story sense of ourselves, it's from this third concept of ourselves, that all good simply flows into human life. It's because we're intelligent as expressions of this infinite love. That's why we can show forth that intelligence by doing our jobs better, for example. It's because we're strong and loving as expressions of this infinite love. That's why we can show forth that strength and that love by being better parents, by being better grandparents. It's because wholeness and wellness are built right into who we are as expressions of infinite love. That's why we can show forth that wholeness and that wellness by being healthier. If we're purely spiritual, how do you explain those other 2 concepts, the ground floor and the second story? The first thing that we can say is, from an absolute perspective, they have no actual reality. They're simply human perceptions. They're simply human concepts, human beliefs. But these human perceptions, these human beliefs, have neither been created by this infinite love that fills all space, nor could they even be known to this infinite love. And in fact, these human concepts have no actual substance. That said, the human appearance of things, our highest collective perception of God's creation, can't help but reflect in some measure the beauty of spiritual life. So all of the beautiful things about human existence, and I mentioned just some of those things at the start of the talk, are to be cherished, celebrated, appreciated, not because they represent the absolute spiritual reality that Mary Baker Eddy found in the scriptures, but because even as a human perception of things, they have great value. And as we grow spiritually, all of the beautiful things about human existence become more beautiful because we see them in a more spiritual way, while all of the bad things about human existence, step by step, simply fade away because we see there's not actually something holding them in place. They're not rooted. They're not anchored in anything. They have no actual principle, all of those bad things. We, on the other hand, are rooted and grounded, absolutely anchored in the infinitude of this love. And that's why we exist in complete security. That's why we can prove that our perfection is intact. We can prove that our perfection is intact by overcoming sin, for example. And in Christian Science, it's very important to overcome sin. But we overcome sin not as a part of identity, but as a lie about identity. Not as a part of identity, because identity in truth is sinless as this infinite love is sinless. When a dog comes out of a lake or out of a river, what does the dog do? The dog shakes himself off. The dog shakes herself off to become dry, to be free of the water. But the water is no part of the dog. In the same way, we can shake off sin because sin is no part of who we are as the children of God. There's a passage in the Bible that says just that. And it's in the Bible book of Ephesians. And I'm going to read it to you from the New Revised Standard Version in English. This is what it says. You were taught to put away your former way of life, your old self, corrupt and deluded by its lusts, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to clothe yourselves with the new self, created according to the likeness of God, in true righteousness and holiness. Created according to the likeness of God, in true righteousness and holiness. The person who best showed forth that true righteousness and holiness was Jesus. If you read the Gospels, it almost seems as if Jesus is always feeling his oneness with God. It seems as if Jesus is always seeking to know the will of God and accomplishing the will of God. I think that it was perhaps for that reason that he was unafraid to reach out and touch the man who was filled with leprosy, and so to bring him healing, even as he had brought healing to so many others. And not only did Jesus heal people, he also reformed them. He healed and reformed them by seeing them in the light of God's infinitude, by seeing their perfection that they would always have as the reflections of this infinite, unopposed love. Jesus showed forth perfectly the Christ. The Christ is the true idea of God as infinite love. But the Christ existed before Jesus, and Jesus showed forth perfectly the Christ. In fact, he embodied the Christ. But the Christ exists with each of us, right where we are, even as we're listening to this Christian Science talk. The Christ is always with us to encourage us, to strengthen us, to awaken us to our true spiritual nature. The Christ is always with us to heal us. That was the experience of a friend of mine. The year was 1984, and she was in the hospital trying to decide exactly what to do because she had just received a diagnosis of cancer. Doctors had found several tumors in her abdomen. The doctors hardly knew what to recommend in terms of treatment. They thought perhaps an exploratory operation and then maybe chemotherapy. But they didn't hold out much hope that she would be living much longer. So she was in the hospital, but she wasn't receiving any medical treatment. What she was doing was she was praying, she was studying the Bible and science and health, and she was praying with a Christian Science practitioner. Together they were striving to see the perfection and the health that she would always have as the very daughter of God. Her husband, a very dear man indeed, practically begged her to have the exploratory operation. So she decided to go ahead with it. But this time, the doctors didn't find one single tumor. In fact, their words to her after the operation were, "You're clean as a baby." This healing happened in 1984. Today, my friend is very active in her church. She has a very active family life and a wonderful circle of friends. You can hardly imagine her gratitude. Thinking this way, that God is absolutely perfect, and each of us is absolutely perfect as God's own spiritual expression, sometimes can require a certain inner discipline. Perhaps you have a neighbor who simply gets mad at you for no reason. It requires perhaps a certain inner discipline to not react, but to turn to God in prayer, to see that neighbor in the light of God's own perfection. And to see if there's some step that you can take to reconcile with the neighbor. Or perhaps you have a family member who for the last several decades has had a behavior that's been so problematical for the rest of the family. It requires perhaps a certain inner discipline to continue to love and to support that family member, even as they reform and stop that behavior that's been so problematical. So, thinking this way is not always easy. I'm being very honest. But I'm also being very honest when I say that thinking this way is definitely worth it. Because time and again, I've seen thinking like this bring healing to individuals and to families. I think that it requires a certain inner discipline to think this way in the light of a pandemic, something that continues to affect many, many people around the world. And you might even ask yourself if thinking this way in the midst of a pandemic is responsible. The answer to that question is yes. It's that Christian Science isn't practiced in isolation, but Christian Science teaches that we are to reach out and put our arms around the whole world in prayer and to be uplifted with the whole world in prayer. Christian Science teaches a warm appreciation of all good human things. That certainly includes an appreciation of the nurse who spends long hours at the hospital caring for others, or an appreciation of fellow citizens who, if it's asked, maintain 2 meters distance between themselves and the other person, for example, or an appreciation of the elected official who's able to communicate necessary information to the general population in a way that actually encourages people. In my own life, I've seen thinking this way definitely provides a protection. I've traveled, I think, to 33 or 34 countries around the world, often to countries where the level of public sanitation is not that high. I think I've been in Brazil 5 or 6 times, Brazil where dengue fever is almost always a problem. I can remember being in Beira, Mozambique some years ago when that city was being very challenged with malaria. But when I've traveled to these places, it hasn't been with my eyes closed. It's been with my eyes open to see the protecting power of God, the power of God to protect me and to protect everyone. And what I've experienced, at least in some degree, is that to the degree your thought is filled with love and goodwill, just filled, there's actually no space left over for fear or even for an image of disease. And the person becomes kind of like a law of protection to him or herself. I remember in February and March of 2 years ago, 2020, I was on a lecture tour in 3 African countries, South Africa, Nigeria, and Ghana. And I had just finished lecturing in Nigeria, and my throat had become quite sore. I asked a friend who is a Christian Scientist to pray for me. This was a Sunday. Late that night, I received an instant message from a family member in Canada saying that the Canadian government was asking that all Canadians come back to Canada immediately while there were still commercial airlines in operation. I prayed about it through the night and decided to try to do my best to get back to Canada as soon as I could. But Monday morning, my throat was still sore. I asked my friend to please continue praying for me. That was a moment of very uncertain human circumstances for me. I didn't know. Would I be able to find flights between Lagos, Nigeria, and Ottawa, Canada? Would I be well enough to travel, or would I have to spend weeks or months alone in a hotel room far from home? I wanted to travel, and of course I wanted to have good health, but even more important, I wanted to practice the golden rule, which is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's the golden rule that Jesus taught. And if a Christian Scientist is sick with a contagious disease, and if it's necessary to communicate that information in order to protect others, that's definitely what he or she does. It's simply the practical ethics of the New Testament. So had that been necessary, I definitely would have done that. I prayed. And I prayed essentially with two ideas. First, that everything that I have, I get directly and exclusively from God. Just like every ray of light from the sun gets everything directly and exclusively from the sun, and not from the other rays. And of course, all that I could ever get from God is good. Even like all that everybody in truth can ever get from God is pure good. The second idea with which I prayed was that my home is not a physical location. My home is the consciousness of this infinite, unopposed love. And I knew that I have that consciousness, and that therefore in some way I could prove it. I began to call the airlines, but in March of 2020, getting through to the airlines, at least from Lagos, Nigeria, was very hard. So I started to look online, and after prayer and work, I found an itinerary that would have me leaving actually the next day. It would be 2 consecutive days of travel. I would be in 5 cities and 4 countries. But the ticket seemed realistic. So I bought the ticket and spent the rest of that day praying for myself and praying for the world. I woke up the next morning, Tuesday morning, feeling just fine. I thanked my friend for his prayers. I left the hotel very early in the morning. I respected the spirit and the letter of all of the requirements and all of the airplanes and all of the airports, including going through the thermal scanner in Accra, Ghana. And I returned home very safe and very happy late Wednesday night. And I was very grateful. Oh, and I self-isolated for a couple of weeks, which was what the Canadian government was asking those who had come from abroad to do. I wanted to recount that experience so that you would have confidence wherever this pandemic finds you or wherever life itself finds you. You can maintain this idea of perfect God, infinite perfect God, and each of us as perfect. And you will be led, and you'll find healing if that's the requirement. And of course, whatever steps that we're led to take on the basis of this perfection of God, the perfection of each of us, we can take those steps with confidence and with a great sense of serenity. But this idea of perfect God, perfect man is always there to guide us and to sustain us. Sometimes thinking this way can almost change the human character of the person. That was the experience of a friend of mine who learned of Christian Science when he was a teenager. He grew up in a low-income family, and he hardly knew his father. His father was not really present in his life. And one of my friend's favorite activities was going out and drinking with his buddies. But he had a neighbor who was a Christian Scientist. He liked this neighbor. He was a quiet man. He was a man of integrity. He certainly had a lot of trust in God. One time, this neighbor invited my friend to go with him to the Christian Science church, to his Christian Science church. And in Christian Science churches in Germany and around the world, there's Sunday school for young people up to age 20. So in effect, it was an invitation to go to Sunday school. My friend thought about it and accepted the invitation. And what he heard in that Sunday school had a great impact on him, because he heard for the very first time that he has a perfect Father, Mother, God, infinite love, and that he's always perfect as a perfect son of this perfect Father, Mother, God, infinite love. He loved that idea. He loved that idea so much that he began attending that Sunday school regularly. And you know what it's like if you have a house plant that doesn't get any water for maybe a week or 10 days and then finally gets some water, it just comes to life. Well, that was very much what happened to my friend. The ideas that he was hearing in the Christian Science Sunday School were really beginning to change the way he was thinking about himself and about the world around him. There were many changes in him. One was he really liked his friends, but he decided he didn't want to drink anymore, so he stopped drinking. And then a way opened up for him to be able to go to university. Now, this was surprising because, as I said, he came from a low-income family, and this was in the United States where most of the time university costs a lot of money. He was accepted in the program. He was thrilled. In that program, he worked very hard on his studies, but I believe he worked even harder on himself. He wanted to express so much love towards the other students, towards the professors, towards everyone. Now, maybe 10 years later, he graduated from the program. He has a job that's just right for him. He's very active in his community. He and his wife have a little boy. I think what impresses me most in his case is, no, not that he went to university and now has the job that's just right for him, but that this idea of God as infinite Father, Mother, God, infinite love, has enriched his life so much. And now he, through the way he's living, is enriching the lives of others. His life has a spiritual and moral dimension that it just never had before. I can hardly think of my friend without thinking of the 10 Commandments. We probably all know the 10 Commandments a little bit. Maybe we've seen images of Moses with a tablet in each arm. Of course, the 10 Commandments can be found in the Bible book of Exodus. The 10 Commandments have been very important in the evolution of humanity. The 10 Commandments were very important in the ministry of Jesus. He references them often. And as I said, throughout history, they've been very important. The very first commandment, to have no gods before me. To me, that means to recognize this infinite love that is God. The next commandment, to have no graven images. Usually we might think of a graven image as being a statue that a person might bow down to and worship. But a graven image can sometimes be just mental. Even a sickness itself can be a graven image that we need not worship. The last couple of years, many of us have been forced to learn new technologies. Well, a concept of ourselves as maybe not being very good with technology. You see, that would be a graven image that we don't need to worship. The next commandment, to not take the name of God in vain, that certainly means to speak politely. That certainly, to me, means to not swear. But to me, it also means to not take the nature of God in vain, but to recognize God as being infinite, unopposed love, and to live consistently with that love. The next commandment, to remember the Sabbath, to keep it holy. I love to go to church on Sunday, but I also love to think of my own holiness and the holiness of everybody around me every day of the week. The next commandment, honor your father and your mother. It just makes good sense to honor our human parents, even as we honor everything good in everyone around us. The next commandment, to not kill, obviously important literally, but sometimes there are figurative ways of thinking of that commandment as well. Sometimes people act as a kind of a killjoy. Sometimes, for example, a teacher might be entertaining a very limited concept of the capacities of a student. The next commandment, to not commit adultery, that certainly means to be faithful in your marriage. It certainly means to always have clean, pure thoughts. I love to think of it as meaning to always be reliable in your relationships. So, for example, if you say you're going to do something, you follow through and do it. The next commandment, to not steal. To the degree we recognize we have all good from God, there's no desire to steal. The next commandment, to not bear false witness. telling the truth all the time is very important. In fact, truth is a synonym for God in Christian Science. So it's very important to always be a person of integrity. The last commandment, to not covet. That means, again, to have your eyes open to the infinite good that you have, directly and exclusively from God. I mentioned that the Ten Commandments have been very important in the evolution of humanity. And I think that one of the reasons for that is, in a sense, the Ten Commandments define our spiritual identity. For example, the daughter of God has no limited self-image, but the daughter of God knows that she can do whatever God would have her do for the glory of God. Or the little boy who's 12 years old, I'm persuaded, wants to tell the truth. Why? It's simply his nature. And the idea of stealing is just simply not part of who the child of God is, because the Son of God doesn't want to steal. So in a sense, the Ten Commandments define our spiritual identity. So the Ten Commandments never judge us. The Ten Commandments never condemn us. The Ten Commandments are always supporting us in our showing forth our true spiritual nature as the reflections of this infinite love. I mentioned that the child of God always has whatever he or she needs. That was the experience of a friend of mine who made a cross-country move in order to accept a new job. Everything was going smoothly until, because of organizational changes, his job was eliminated. So he didn't have a job. What he did have was a wife, 2 small children, and a mortgage. It was a very serious situation for them. Perhaps a little bit like the situation might be for many people in the Hamburg area or in other parts of Germany, where as we're coming out of this pandemic, and even as we're looking at, in some cases, inflation, people may be very pressed financially. My friend prayed, but he didn't start his prayers with what he didn't have. He started his prayers by thinking about just how great God's love was, just how great God's love is for him, for his wife, and his 2 precious children. And then he began just to have a wonderful sense of peace. He didn't know how things would work out, but he knew they would. He was confident. And in fact, he had the thought it would actually be impossible for God not to meet their needs because of just how much God loved them. Not long after that, he was offered a job. This new job was going to require that he learn new skills, develop new capacities, but he was confident that with God he could do the work. So he accepted the job. Now, maybe 6 or 7 years later, he's done very well at that job. He's been much appreciated where he's working. The job has been a great blessing to the organization, to him, and to his family. The whole experience confirmed for him that the love of God would always be there for him and for his family. The whole experience confirmed for him that the love of God would always be there for every individual and for every family. Does Christian Science always heal? That's a good question. Mary Baker Eddy discovered Christian Science in 1866, and since then, those who've turned to this system of healing have experienced the same problems as the rest of humanity, including the same health problems. Sometimes they've been healed immediately, sometimes they haven't. But the overall record of Christian Science healing since 1866 is a very strong record indeed. Mary Baker Eddy went on to found the Church of Christ Scientists that has branches in Germany and in many countries around the world. She served as the pastor of the church, as the pastor emeritus. She also founded a series of magazines, Der Raut on Christian Science, which is published in German, of course, and in other languages, the Herald of Christian Science. The Sentinel and the Herald of Christian Science, der Heraut von Christian Science, is published monthly. The Herald, as I say, is published monthly, as is also the Christian Science Journal, a monthly publication. And the Christian Science Sentinel is a weekly publication. In each and every issue of these magazines, since more than 100 years now, have always been published verified testimonies of healing. Healings of everything from blindness to cancer to AIDS, healings of eating disorders, healings of Alzheimer's disease, healings of broken bones and of drug addiction. Up until now, some 65,000 such healings have been published. When you read these healings, it almost feels as if you're reading the Gospels, which are just filled with the healings that were accomplished by Jesus and by his disciples. Also, in Christian Science churches around the world, there are Wednesday testimony meetings. And during these meetings, people tell of how applying the teachings of Christian Science has brought healing to themselves, to their families, and to the community. In many cases, human thought is on that level, the ground floor level, or on the second floor level, those two first false senses of what identity is. But healing always happens to the degree we realize our purely spiritual nature as children of God. And of course, realizing our purely spiritual nature as children of God, sometimes that takes a lot of work. Sometimes it's not easy. But it's always a joyous path, and it's also always a privilege to be able to follow in the footsteps of the Master, Jesus. Up until now, all of the healings that I've recounted have been healings of individuals or how to pray for yourself or for your family. But I wanted to recount an experience that shows how to pray for the collectivity. This could be for your city, the city of Hamburg. This could be for your suburb. This could be for refugees, of which there are so many in Germany and other European countries at the moment, or it could be for the war. This was the experience of a friend of mine in a developing country. My friend accepted the job as the financial controller of a large government institution that employed more than 1,400 people. But after 2 or 3 months, he came to realize that employee theft was an enormous problem. That employee theft was taking several forms. First, there was a group of employees who were manipulating the computer system with the collaboration of the cashiers in order to rob the organization. There was the issuing of false receipts and even the outright theft of equipment from the premises. My friend wanted the accounting to be in conformity with national and international standards. He wanted the theft to be eliminated. He wanted there to be no corruption whatsoever. He wanted the organization to truly be serving its clients as it was intended to do. He took several steps. He modernized the computer system. He modernized the accounting system. He set up a sort of an internal auditing system. He improved the inventory system, and he began to work to increase employee salaries. But most especially, he prayed. He prayed that his eyes would be opened to see the perfection and the honesty, the integrity of each and every one of those 1,400 employees. My friend's efforts to reform the organization were met with stiff resistance. There was a group of employees that wrote a false report about my friend and sent that report to his immediate superior and to the Minister of Finance in his country. All of the allegations were investigated. None of them were true. My friend's innocence was recognized. He kept on praying. And then a colleague of his told him that he had inadvertently overheard a conversation between 2 other colleagues. And they had said that really there was just one way to prevent this reforms to stop these reforms from happening. And that was to eliminate my friend using witchcraft. Now, I should say that in some countries around the world, in some cultures around the world, witchcraft is a way of seeking to personally control another person. I'm not sure about in Germany, but in Canada, we have our own ways of doing that in a work setting. That can be backbiting, backstabbing, campaign of lies. Sometimes office politics can be brutal. But in this culture, it was witchcraft. My friend heard that, but he was unimpressed. He was still praying with this idea that there's just infinite love in its expression. Not long after that, he was alone one Saturday, alone in the office working, and he suddenly felt a very sharp pain in his body, and a part of his body seemed paralyzed. He recognized right away that this was impersonal resistance to these reforms that were going to bless everyone. He prayed, and specifically, he prayed with this passage from Science and Health. It says here, "Your influence for good depends upon the weight you throw into the right scale. The good you do and embody gives you the only power obtainable." He knew that he was embodying good. He knew his only motivation was to bless that organization so that the clients would be well served. It took him a couple of days of steadfast prayer, but the pain stopped entirely and he was able to move freely. He kept on praying. By this time, the administration had assigned him a couple of bodyguards at work because he'd received direct threats, but he was unfazed. He was so confident that all that exists is this infinite love in its expression. And then something truly wonderful happened. His colleagues at the same level as him within the organization, instead of just remaining indifferent and saying, "Oh, if you want to do those reforms, you go ahead." No, they finally began to support these reforms. And not long after that, all of the employees were supporting the reforms. My friend could see that in the books. He could see it in the internal audits. He could see it in the inventory. It was a great victory for my friend, but also a great victory for that organization in a country where oftentimes corruption has been a problem. I don't think my friend ever once had the thought, "Oh, I'm just one person. How can my prayers make a difference?" His confidence wasn't in him personally. His confidence was in the very nature of reality, this one infinite love and its expression. I wanted to read you one last passage from this book, Science and Health. This is a deep passage about identity that is read almost at the very end of every Christian Science Sunday service. It's also the very last thing that is read in Christian Science Sunday School sessions. In it, the author uses the term man to mean men and women, boys and girls in their eternal spiritual nature. Here's the passage. "There is no life, truth, intelligence, nor substance in matter. All is infinite mind and its infinite manifestation, for God is all in all. Spirit is immortal truth. Matter is mortal error. Spirit is the real and eternal. Matter is the unreal and temporal. Spirit is God, and man is his image and likeness. Therefore, man is not material. He is spiritual." Well, let me summarize. I began by giving you some basic background information about Mary Baker Eddy, how she found in the scriptures a concept of God as being infinite, unopposed love, the only substance of the universe, how she discovered a sense of each of us as being a unique spiritual expression of this pure, infinite, unopposed love, how this concept of who God is, this concept of who we are, comes to each of us, wherever we are in human life, to support us, to encourage us, to strengthen us, to make us better people. It comes to heal us. This concept of who God is comes to reform us and to redeem all humanity. I wanted you to have confidence so that whatever you're praying for, again, if you're praying for what's happening in Ukraine, if you're praying for something very local, such as more available public housing or something like that, if you're praying for the educational system in your city, if you're praying to diminish crime, whatever you're praying for, start your prayers with what you understand about God. As my friend who lost his job started his prayers with what he understood about God. So even if you're praying for something as big as, let's say, global climate change or a global problem like racism, start with God and stick with his perfection. Stick with perfect God and perfect man. And of course, when we're praying, to the degree we live consistent with our prayers are going to be effective. So for example, let's say that we're praying for greater honesty and greater integrity, greater purity of motive amongst elected officials in our own country or in another country. Our prayers in that direction are going to be effective to the degree that we live that purity, to the degree we live that honesty and that integrity. Just like it would be the money that we would have in our bank account that would mean that a check that we would give somebody would be accepted as valid. It's the way that we live our lives all the time that that gives our prayer power and that gives our prayer authority. My friend who reformed that organization, it wasn't just his words, it was the way he was living his life. He was bringing his whole life behind those prayers, and that's what made his prayers effective. So we can live our prayers so much that our lives become a constant prayer, a constant affirmation of this infinite unopposed love and its expression. I wanted to heartily recommend an in-depth study of the Bible as a way of understanding even more fully your spiritual nature. I wanted to heartily recommend an in-depth study of Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures as a way of understanding the Bible in its practical spiritual nature. Again, much thanks to Third Church of Christ Scientist, Hamburg, Altona, for sponsoring this talk. And lastly, much thanks to each of you for watching, for participating, and much thanks to each of you for your kind attention. Thanks, and auf Wiedersehen.